Welcome to Week 8 of this creative writing class. So far we have explored story structure, stronger scenes, setting and world building. This week we explore something equally powerful: who is telling the story, and how. Instead of looking at where the story happens, we begin to think about how the reader experiences the story. Because no story exists on the page by itself. Every story is filtered through a lens. That lens is the narrative perspective, the voice and viewpoint through which the story is told, and that choice changes everything. Two writers could describe the exact same event, the same characters, the same setting, the same plot, and yet the stories could feel completely different depending on who is telling it and how it is being told. For example, a story told by a frightened child will feel very different from the same story told by a confident adult. A story told by someone looking back on the past will feel different from a story unfolding in the present moment. Even the personality of the narrator, their humor, their fears, their opinions, can shape how readers interpret what is happening. So today we explore two closely connected ideas: point of view and voice. These are two of the most powerful tools a writer has. They influence what the reader knows, what the reader feels, how close the reader feels to the characters, and even how trustworthy the story seems. Choosing the right perspective and developing a strong narrative voice can transform a simple story into something vivid, engaging, and memorable. Today we'll look at how writers make those choices, and how you can experiment with them in your own writing. Most stories tend to use one of three main narrative perspectives. These are first person, second person, third person. Each of these perspectives changes the relationship between the reader and the story. It influences how close we feel to the characters, how much information we receive, and how the events of the story are experienced. One useful way to think about perspective is to imagine where the storyteller is standing. Are they inside the character's mind? Are they speaking directly to the reader? Or are they observing events from a slight distance? These positions shape the entire reading experience. First-person narration uses the word I. The narrator is inside the story, telling the events directly from their own experience. Instead of observing the character from the outside, the reader hears the story through the narrator's own voice. For example, I knew the moment I saw the house that something was wrong. Here, the narrator is not describing someone else's experience, they are describing their own. Because of this, first-person narration often creates a strong feeling of closeness and intimacy between the reader and the character. We are not simply watching events unfold from a distance, we are inside one character's mind. We hear their thoughts, we feel their emotions. We see the world exactly as they see it. Everything the reader understands about the story is filtered through that character's interpretation of events. This can make stories feel very emotional, immediate, and personal, almost like someone is confiding directly in the reader. It is one of the reasons first person is often used in stories that explore strong internal experiences, such as fear, love, grief, or personal change. However, first-person narration also comes with an important limitation: the reader only knows what the narrator knows. If the narrator does not witness something, the reader does not see it either. If the narrator misunderstands something, the reader may misunderstand it too. And sometimes the narrator may not reveal everything. Because of this, first-person narration can create something very interesting in storytelling: the unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator is a character whose version of events cannot always be fully trusted. They may misunderstand situations, remember things incorrectly, hide information, or interpret the world through their own biases and emotions. Sometimes this is done deliberately by the writer to create mystery or tension. Other times it simply reflects the character's personality and perspective. Either way, it reminds us that when we read a first-person story, we are not necessarily seeing the whole truth. We are seeing one person's version of the truth. Second-person narration uses the word you. The narrator speaks directly to the reader as if they are the person experiencing the events of the story. For example, you open the door and immediately regret it. In this sentence, the reader is not simply watching the action happen to a character. Instead, the story places the reader themselves into the moment. The reader becomes the one opening the door, feeling the tension, and reacting to what happens next. Because of this, second-person narration can create a very strong sense of immediacy and immersion. It can feel almost like the reader has stepped directly into the story world. Rather than observing events from the outside, the reader is positioned inside the action, moving through the story as it unfolds. This can be a powerful technique when writers want the reader to feel tension, urgency, emotional intensity, or psychological closeness to the situation. However, second-person narration can also feel slightly uncomfortable or confronting for some readers. This is because the text is telling the reader what they are doing, thinking, or feeling. For example, if the story says, "You feel terrified," a reader might think, "Actually, I don't feel terrified at all." Because of this, second person can sometimes create a sense of resistance if it is used over a long period of time. For that reason, it is used less frequently in full-length novels. However, when used carefully and deliberately, second-person narration can be extremely effective. Writers often use it to create a sense of intensity, immediacy, or psychological closeness. You'll often find second-person narration appearing in experimental fiction, where writers are playing with narrative form, short stories, where the perspective can be maintained effectively for a shorter piece. Psychological narratives, where the writer wants the reader to feel directly involved in the character's experience. It is also sometimes used in interactive storytelling, such as game narratives, or choose-your-own-adventure-style writing, where the reader is literally guiding the story forward. When used thoughtfully, second-person narration can create a unique storytelling experience, one where the reader doesn't just observe the story, but steps directly into it. Third-person narration is probably the most common perspective used in modern fiction. Instead of using I, the narrator refers to characters using he, she, they. The narrator is not a character inside the story but rather an observing voice describing what is happening. For example, she knew the moment she saw the house that something was wrong. Here the narrator is describing the character's experience from the outside rather than speaking as the character themselves. This creates a slight narrative distance between the storyteller and the characters. One of the main advantages of third-person narration is that it gives the writer more flexibility. The story can focus closely on a single character's thoughts and experiences, or it can move between multiple characters as the plot develops. For example, a writer might show one scene through one character's perspective, and later shift to another character's point of view to reveal different information. Because of this, third-person narration allows writers to control how much the reader sees and understands at different points in the story. Another helpful way to think about third-person narration is to imagine a camera in a film. Sometimes the camera zooms in very close to a character's face, so we can see their emotions clearly. Other times the camera pulls back to show a wider view of the scene and everything happening around them. Third-person narration works in a similar way. The writer can choose to move closer to a character's inner thoughts, or step further back to show the wider world of the story. This flexibility is one of the reasons third person is widely used in novels, especially in stories with larger casts of characters or complex plots. However, third-person narration also comes with a challenge. Because the narrator is slightly outside the character, the writer has to work a little harder to maintain emotional connection with the reader. If the writing becomes too distant or overly descriptive, the reader may begin to feel detached from the characters and their experiences. In other words, the story can start to feel as though we are simply watching events happen, rather than emotionally experiencing them. Good third-person writing avoids this problem by keeping the reader closely connected to the character's thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, even while maintaining that narrative distance. When handled well, third-person narration allows writers to combine the emotional depth of close character experience with the broader storytelling freedom of an external narrator. One of the most common technical issues that new writers encounter is inconsistent perspective. This happens when the narrative point of view shifts unintentionally during a scene. In other words, the story begins from one character's perspective, but without warning the narrative suddenly slips into another character's thoughts or feelings. For example, a scene might begin with us experiencing events through one character's mind. We see what they notice, we hear their thoughts, and we feel their emotions. But then, halfway through the same paragraph, the narration suddenly reveals what another character is thinking. Then perhaps another character's reaction appears as well. When this happens, the narrative perspective jumps rapidly between characters. This is often called head-hopping. The reader is suddenly jumping from one character's head into another, without any clear transition. And when this happens, the reader's sense of orientation inside the story can quickly become confused. The problem with head-hopping is not simply that it changes perspective. The real issue is that it breaks the reader's sense of grounding. When we read a story, we subconsciously settle into a particular perspective. We understand whose experience we are following and how the world of the story is being filtered. But when the narrative begins to jump unpredictably between characters, thoughts, the reader loses that anchor. Instead of becoming absorbed in the scene, they begin to wonder, whose perspective am I in now? How does the narrator know this? Where exactly am I in the story? Once that confusion appears, the reader is pulled out of the fictional world, and immersion is one of the most important things a story can create. When a reader feels immersed, they forget they are reading words on a page. They feel as though they are inside the story itself. But when the narrative perspective becomes unstable or inconsistent, that illusion breaks. This doesn't mean perspective can never change. In many stories it does. For example, a novel might move between the viewpoints of several different characters. However, these shifts must be intentional and clearly controlled. Writers usually signal a shift in perspective by starting a new scene, a new chapter, or a clear narrative break. This gives the reader time to reorient themselves and understand whose experience they are now following. In other words, the storytelling lens can move, but it should move deliberately and smoothly, not accidentally. A stable and consistent perspective helps the reader remain fully engaged in the story, trusting the writer to guide them through the narrative world. Now we move to something that makes writing truly distinctive. Voice. Point of view decides who tells the story. Voice decides how that story feels on the page. In other words, point of view is the position of the storyteller, but voice is the personality behind the storytelling. Voice is what gives writing its character. It is the tone, style and energy that runs through the sentences and shapes how the reader experiences the story. You could think of voice as the sound of the narrator speaking through the words. Even when two writers describe the same event, their voices will make the scene feel completely different. Voice comes from many small choices working together. It grows out of things like the rhythm of sentences, whether the writing flows slowly and thoughtfully or quickly and sharply. The choice of words, formal or informal, simple or descriptive. The pacing of language, whether the writing moves calmly or urgently. The emotional tone, humorous, reflective, tense, warm, sarcastic or dramatic. The narrator's attitude and bias, how they view the world and the events around them. All of these elements combine to create the overall feeling of the writing. To see how voice works, imagine two writers describing the exact same location, perhaps a supermarket, a farmhouse, or an empty playground. One writer might describe the place with warmth and nostalgia, noticing the small details and memories connected to it. Another writer might describe the same place with tension or unease, focusing on shadows, silence, or signs of neglect. The physical setting is the same, but the voice changes how the reader experiences it. The scene might feel comforting, unsettling, humorous, or melancholic, depending entirely on the narrator's voice. This is why voice is such an important part of writing. It is what makes writing feel individual. It's what allows readers to recognize a writer's style after reading only a few paragraphs. When voice is strong and clear, the writing feels authentic and alive. And over time, as writers practice and experiment with language, they begin to develop a voice that feels distinctively their own. Last week we talked about how setting shapes atmosphere. The physical world of a story, the place, the weather, the surroundings, can influence how a reader feels about what is happening. A quiet forest might feel mysterious. A crowded city street might feel energetic or overwhelming. An empty house might feel peaceful or unsettling. Setting helps create the environment of the story. But voice does something slightly different. Voice gives the story its identity. It's the quality that makes a piece of writing feel like it belongs to a particular storyteller, rather than simply being a description of events. Voice is what makes writing feel distinctive, recognizable, human. When voice is strong, readers begin to feel as if there is a real mind behind the words. It feels as though someone is speaking to them, not just presenting information, but sharing an experience, a perspective, or a way of seeing the world. You might notice this when you read certain authors. After a while, you can recognize their writing style almost immediately. Not because of the plot, but because of how they express things. Their voice becomes familiar. When voice is weak or overly generic, writing can sometimes feel flat. The story itself might still be interesting, the events might be exciting or emotional, but the language does not carry a strong sense of personality. The writing may feel like it could have been written by almost anyone. In those cases, the story can feel a little distant, even if the ideas behind it are good. A strong voice, on the other hand, helps bring the writing to life. It adds character, tone, and individuality to the storytelling. Developing voice is often one of the biggest turning points in a writer's journey. In the early stages of learning to write, many people focus on technique, structure, dialogue, description, and grammar, and those skills are very important. But at a certain point, something else begins to emerge. The writing starts to feel more natural, more personal, more confident. This is the stage where writing stops sounding like a practice exercise and begins to sound like a real storyteller speaking. It's when the writer's unique way of seeing and describing the world begins to come through on the page. And that is what ultimately makes writing memorable. Everything we've explored so far in this course gradually builds toward this particular shift in a writer's development. When people first begin writing stories, the process is often guided mainly by instinct and imagination. An idea appears, a character forms, a scene begins to unfold. Writers start putting words on the page because they feel drawn to a story they want to tell. At this stage, the focus is often on what happens next. Writers are discovering the story as they write it, allowing the narrative to grow naturally from their ideas and emotions. This instinctive approach is an important part of learning to write. It allows creativity to flow without too many restrictions. But underneath the story itself, the technical decisions that shape how the reader experiences that story may not yet be fully controlled. Writers may not always be consciously choosing the narrative perspective. They may shift viewpoints without noticing. The voice of the narration may change from paragraph to paragraph without a clear intention. These things happen naturally when someone is still learning the craft. Learning to control perspective and voice begins to change that. Because once a writer understands how these tools work, they realize that storytelling is not only about describing events. It is about shaping the reader's entire experience of those events. The writer becomes the person guiding the reader through the story. They decide what the reader knows and what information is revealed, what the reader feels as the story unfolds, what the reader begins to question or suspect, what remains hidden until later in the narrative. These choices influence tension, emotion, mystery, and understanding throughout the story. In other words, the writer begins to control the lens through which the story is seen. When this control becomes deliberate, something important changes. Writing no longer feels like a series of events that simply appeared on the page. Instead, it begins to feel carefully shaped and constructed. The writer understands how to guide the reader's attention. They understand how perspective influences emotion. They understand how voice can color the reader's experience of the story world. This is the point where writing stops feeling accidental, it starts feeling crafted. And that shift marks an important step in the development of any writer. It is the movement from writing instinctively, guided only by ideas, to writing with true narrative control, where creativity and craft work together to shape the story. This week's assignment is designed to help you practice narrative perspective. Write a very short story, maximum 300 words. However, there's an important twist. You will write the same story 3 times, each using a different narrative perspective. Your versions should be written in first person, second person, third person. The events of the story should stay the same, but the perspective will change how the reader experiences the scene. Notice how the voice, tone, and sense of closeness shift, depending on who is telling the story and how it is told. This exercise will help you understand how powerful narrative perspective can be in shaping a reader's experience. Next week we focus on one of the most well-known pieces of advice in creative writing. Show, don't tell. At its heart, this idea is about helping the reader experience the story, rather than simply being told about it. Instead of explaining emotions, situations, or character traits directly, writers use sensory detail, imagery, and action to allow the reader to discover those things for themselves. When writing shows rather than tells, the reader becomes more actively involved in the story. They begin to see the scene, hear the sounds, notice the details, and interpret what those details mean. This creates a richer and more immersive reading experience. See you all next week.